Hello, my name is Dr. Dan Wedding, and this is DrWedding, VB11, Multiple Forms, and the Message Box. This video is an introductory video covering opening more than one form at the same time and passing values between them. This video does not cover the more advanced topic of multiple document interfacing, also known as MDI. I wanted to make that clear so viewers who are looking for MDI help won't be disappointed. For everyone else, please enjoy the video. VB lets you create and use multiple forms in your project. Each form will have its own objects and its own code section. When working with more than one VB form, you have to know how they are related. Form 1 is the form that first appears when you run the program. It is called the parent form. All of the other forms are child forms. Pretend your crazy friend invents a time machine and you accidentally go back in time to the point where your parents first met. If you stop your parents from meeting, you, the child, will cease to exist. If you close a parent form, all of the child forms will also close. Now pretend your parents have a time machine and accidentally go forward in time where you meet your spouse. If they stop the two of you from meeting, they will stop your children, their grandchildren, from existing. This will not harm your parents. If you close a child form, it will not affect the parent form. There are three main commands that you will need to use when working with multiple forms. The commands are show, hide, and close. Show will open an unopened form as well as making a hidden form visible again. Hide will make the forms invisible. If they are made visible again, the information on them is preserved. Close actually closes the form. Any information that was added to the form will be lost. Forms can update objects and variables on other forms. As discussed in an earlier video, VB can be thought of as an outline, and every time you step down a level, you add a dot. To access another form, you just have to start further up the outline. To access an object, such as a button, label, or text box that is on a different form, the form name is added to the start of the command. The command to update textbox1.text on form 2 is shown below. Accessing a variable on a different form is done the same way with one extra step. The variable must be declared as a global variable using friend. Below is an example of declaring double cost as a global variable using friend. This will allow the other forms to modify double cost. The command that would allow any of the forms to update double cost on form 1 is shown below. There is also a pop-up window that can be used instead of another form. It is called the Messagebox. The command to create a message box is shown below. The information between the parentheses is called the parameter list. As the name suggests, it's a list of parameters that the method can use to customize the message box. The first parameter is a string. It is what you want to print on the center of the message box. The method will work with just one parameter as shown below. The second parameter is also a string. It is the title at the top of the message box. The method will work with just two parameters as shown below. The third parameter is the message box buttons. These are the buttons that will show up on the message box. You don't need to memorize the buttons. The list of available buttons will appear below the command as you start to type. After the buttons, the next prompt is the icons, then the default buttons, and so on. You can use the message box as a pop-up to display information and only have an OK button on it. You can also have the option of multiple buttons on the message box. If there are multiple buttons, you can record the button that was pushed. In order to capture the button press, you need to declare a variable. This variable is not an integer, character, or a double. It is a dialog result variable. The command to declare the dialog result is shown below. To record the key press, just set the dialog result variable equal to the Messagebox command as shown below. When you press the button on the Messagebox, the button gets recorded and copied into the dialog result variable as an integer. A list of buttons and their corresponding integers is shown below. Some of the Messagebox information has changed over time. Therefore, using this command may look slightly different in future releases of Visual Studio. For example, there was a hand icon that was retired. The hand still exists, allowing programs that were written using it to continue to work. But now the hand and the stop icon are exactly the same. Let's go through some examples of multiple forms. I have opened up a new project named VB11, and I have generated a new form. Because this project involves opening up a second form, let's go through the process of generating it. Project, add form. And it's going to assume the same type of form that we opened up before, and we hit add. Now I have a second form as well as a first form, and I'm going to format it. Now that I've formatted form 2, let's go to form 1. I've already written the code behind these three buttons. The code is one line: form2.show, form2.hide, and form2.close. Let's take a look at what happens when this program runs. When I run the program, the parent form opens up. If I press the first button, the form2.show command will be issued, and the child form will open. Let's say I'm using form 2, and I enter a value, such as 2. If I hide the form is essentially invisible. All the information is preserved. Therefore, if I show the form again, the information is still there. If I close the form, the information is erased. If I show it then, the information is lost. That's the difference between closing a form and hiding a form. You'll also see that I can close a child form and nothing happens to the parent form. However, if I close a parent form, I will close the child form automatically. Now I'm going to make some modifications to form 1. I'm going to add a text box to this form that will allow me to pass values between form 1 and form 2. Now that I've updated form 1, let's go to form 2 and add some code behind this button. Behind button 1 on form 2, I'm going to read in the information from the text box and write it to the other text box that's on form 1. The command to do this is form1.textbox1.text is going to equal textbox1.text. On the right side of the equal sign is the source. It's form 2's textbox.text. And whatever's there is being put on form 1 textbox.text. Let's see what happens when this program runs. First we have the parent form, then we open up the child form, then we go to the child form and we input a value on the text box. We press the button pass to form 1 and the 3 is copied up to the other form. If I close this form, the 3 is preserved. This was an example of one form updating the objects on another form. In this example, form 2 was updating the text box on form 1. The object that's being updated doesn't matter. It can be simple as a text box, or more complicated like the background color or the opacity. To do this, we'll go to Form 2 and go to the Design. You'll notice there's a lightning bolt here under Form 2. Click on the lightning bolt, go to the top where it says Activated. This subroutine runs when the window has focus, meaning the one that's selected by the operating system. So we'll double click here and it opens up Form 2 Activated. We'll do a try catch, and inside the try catch we're going to say if this form has focus, we'll set the opacity of the other form to 50%. Form1.opacity equals 0.5. And we're also going to make sure that this form has 100% opacity. When a form is referencing itself, it doesn't use Form 1 or Form 2, it uses me. So instead of Form2.opacity, it would be me.opacity. Now we're going to go to Form 1 and perform the same operation. Now watch what happens when we run this program. We have the parent form, but when we show Form 2, Form 1 becomes 50% visible. Opacity is a measure of visibility. 0.5 correlates to 50%. If I select Form 1, its opacity goes to 1, correlating to 100%, and Form 2's opacity goes down to 50%. This form is controlling its own opacity as well as the parent's. And when I click on the parent, it's controlling its own opacity as well as the child's. There is a minor bug with this program. If I select the child form and close it, the parent form stays at 50% opacity. When you look at the try catch for Form 1, it tries to set the opacity to 50% on Form 2. But Form 2 is closed, so it jumps to the catch and it never resets the opacity to 1. To fix this problem, we just have to move me.opacity to be the first command in the list. That way it will reset its opacity before trying to reset the second one. I also should make this same change to Form 2. However, if Form 1 closes, Form 2 will close and it won't be stuck at 50% opacity anyways. But to be consistent, let's change it in Form 2 also. Let's see if it works now. Parent form, child form, opacity changing. But this time when I close the child form, the parent form returns to its original state. Up to this point, I've just been changing objects and properties on other forms. Next, I'm going to update variables on other forms. I've added comments to the program. Now we're going to add a new variable in Form 1 that's global. We're also going to declare this variable using friend. This will allow this variable to be passed between the two forms. Now let's go to Form 2. When we enter a value here and press the button Pass to Form 1, I'm going to copy the information that's on this text box into int Fred. I'm going to comment out the previous command and copy the information to the variable instead. As before, we start off with form1 dot. As you can see, as I start to type the variable name, it shows up in the list. This lets you know that it's valid, meaning that you can pass it to the other form. Now I'm going to have to go back to form 1. I'm no longer directly printing the information to this text box. I'm copying it into a variable. Let's prove the information is inside of a variable by adding a button. Now, let's write the code for showMeIntFred. ShowMeIntFred is just going to take IntFred and print it to the text box. When I first run this program and I press this button, IntFred will be 0 by default. I can then open up the second form, type in a value, and send it back to form 1. If I press this button after I do that, the new value will show up on the text box. Let's demonstrate this. Start, bring over the parent form, and hit showMeIntFred. The value is 0 by default. Now I'm going to show form 2, and I'm going to type in a number. I'm going to pass it back to form 1, but it's not going to be written to the text box, it's going to be written to IntFred. When I come back to the parent and hit showMeFred, it's 5. This is demonstrating that I'm actually updating the variable and not the object. Updating the variable and an object is essentially the same thing. The only difference is the variable in form 1 must be declared as friend and global. Now let's start to investigate the message box. I'm going to go to form 2 and I'm going to put this command inside of a try catch. It's always a good idea when you're reading something in from a text box to have the command inside of a try catch. I usually use my message boxes inside of a catch statement. The command is very simple. Messagebox dot show, and inside the parentheses you'll enter a string that will be printed to the center of the box. Let's see what the message box looks like by running the program and intentionally typing in a bad value. First we open the parent form, then we open the child form. When we type in a bad value on the child form and try to pass it to an integer, we'll get this message box. Currently it just says error. That's kind of lame. Let's spruce this up. Instead of just saying error, why don't we add the actual error message? We can do this by concatenating the string or adding on to it. I'm going to say ampersand, but what am I going to add on to it? If you look at the catch, EX as exception, it looks like you're declaring a variable. And you are. If this said dim EX as exception, you'd think that this was an exception variable. And that's exactly what it is. I'm going to type in EX, press the dot. This is the next step on the outline as we discussed earlier. I'm going to select message. Now when I run this program and give it a bad value, it'll say conversion from string A to type integer is not valid. That's a much better message box. The message box has multiple values that you can load into the parameter list. If I keep using the project VB11 to demonstrate this, it'll take all day. Instead, I've written a wizard. In the message box wizard, you can see the default state. These are all the defaults that are assumed if you don't fill them in. When you use Messagebox, you can use one parameter and then close it with a closed parentheses. You can use two parameters, close it with a parentheses. You can use 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 and so on. After 7 parameters, it gets a bit complicated, so I'm only going to demonstrate the first 7 parameters. If I were to run this program by pressing the button down here, you'll see what this command will create. It creates a blank message box with just an OK button on it. This wizard allows you to play around. You can add text, and you can see this text is now here. I can change this text to whatever I want. If I run the program, that's what shows up. The second parameter is just as easy as the first parameter. It's just a text string, but it shows up at the top of the message box on the title bar. And like the message on the center of the text box, you can change it to be whatever you want. So let's advance to the third parameter, the buttons that appear on the message box. If you load a 0, you'll get the OK button. But Messagebox.OK gives you the same result. This is one of the 6 choices you have. OK, cancel, abort, retry, ignore, yes, no, cancel, retry, cancel. So I'm going to choose abort, retry, and ignore. Abort, retry, ignore. By changing the message button parameter, I can choose which buttons show. There's also icons that can be added to the message box. By default, it's 0, but it's the same as none. Watch this parameter right here when I switch it to none. It's MessageboxIcon.none. Again, it's the same as 0. However, I can choose information, warning, question, or error. You'll notice that I have asterisks followed by information. That's because some of these parameters have been retired. They still exist, but they've been rerouted. They do that because older programs might have asterisks or hand in them. Therefore, Microsoft has routed them to the new icons. So information or asterisk are the same. Warning and exclamation point are the same. Error, stop, and hand are all the same. Let's put up the error. You'll get a little tune. You'll get the error message. Let's try information. You'll get an I for information. To prove to you that this is the same as this, let's run information, change it to asterisk, and run it again. You can see that the command is changing, but the actual message box is not. Let's go for warning. The exclamation point and a yellow triangle. That's the warning. However, if I go to exclamation point, it's still the same icon. The next parameter is which button do you want to be the default button if the person presses the return key instead of selecting a button. This defaults to the first button in the list, and that's why there's a ring around the abort button. If I press the return key, it's the same as pressing the abort button. If it's the first button and I press it, it's the same as 0. But the command has changed from 0 to Messagebox default button, button 1. If I choose the second button, and now there's a ring around the second button. And the third button, as expected, has the ring around the third button. There are some other options you can play with down here that I don't use that often. Text justifying right, icon on the right. I ignore this one for the most part. I don't really have a good use for them. The last parameter that I'm going to discuss is the help button. By default, there isn't one. However, if I press yes, you'll notice that these choices over here have disappeared. That's because the help button becomes incompatible with these choices. So let's see what happens when I run the program now. There's now a help button on the message box. If I press the help button, the help window comes up. To make the help work, you have to do these 3 steps. First, you have to add handler, help requested, address of, and then the name of a subroutine. You then put your Messagebox command in the middle, and then you remove the handler after you're done. The word after address of is the name of a subroutine. You then copy this subroutine into your program. The subroutine just shows a new form. We covered how to create a new form earlier. We go to Project, Add New Form. Whatever you put on that form is what your help button is going to be. So this is a help form that's going to help you create a help form. At this point, we're not returning the Keypress. But by selecting this radio button, you can see the information has changed up here. What's changed is I've given you the command that will create a new variable. The variable is named dialog Keypress, and its type is dialog result. When that variable is set equal to the message box, the button you press is stored in dialog Keypress as an integer. Let me demonstrate. If I press retry, it tells me that dialog Keypress is now 4, and that corresponds to the retry button. Let's try yes, no, cancel. Run it again. This time I'm going to press yes. Dialog Keypress is now 6, and yes is 6. So you can use this dialog Keypress in an if statement to determine what your program is going to do depending on which button they pressed on the message box. So you could have a message box that says, do you want to continue? Yes, no. And when the person presses the button, you can look for a 6 or a 7 and make your program run accordingly. Let's use this wizard to configure an error message for the other program. For example, I want this to be an input error. I want only the OK button. I want this to be an error. I want them to only be able to select the OK button. I'm going to ignore the message box options. I'm going to turn off the help button. And I don't want to return anything. And I'm left with this as my message box. And it looks like this. I now can highlight this command, copy it with Control-C, go to my program, replace my message box with Control-V, change my error message to ex.message, and now when the program runs, and I type in an invalid value, I'll get this as my Messagebox error message. I've got the nice little tune that plays, I get the little red X, and I get the actual error that Microsoft is telling me is causing the problem. I hope that if you use the wizard, it's there to let you learn how to use this command. It's not a crutch that you should use every time you want to generate a message box. It's there to teach you the order that the parameters come in and the parameters that you can set. It is a learning aid and not a substitution for learning. In review, VB lets you create and use multiple forms in your project. Each form will have its own objects and its own code section. To add more forms to your project, select Project and then select Add Form. There are three main commands that you will need to use when working with multiple forms. The commands are Show, Hide, and Close. Show will open an unopened form as well as making a hidden, non-visible form visible again. Hide will make the forms invisible. If they are made visible again, the information on them is preserved. Close actually closes the form. Any information that was added to the form will be lost. Forms can update objects and variables on other forms. To access an object, such as a button, label, or text box that's on a different form, the form name needs to be added to the start of the command using dot notation. The command to update textbox.text on Form 2 is shown below. If a variable needs to be updated on another form, the variable needs to be a global variable and declared using friend as shown below. To access a variable on a different form is done the same way as an object. The form name is added before the variable name using dot notation. The command to update int big value on Form 2 is shown below. There is a pre-made pop-up window that can be used instead of another form. It is called the message box. The command to create a message box is shown below. The information between the parentheses is called the parameter list. As the name suggests, it's a list of parameters that the method can use to customize the message box. The parameters that you can use to customize the message box are shown below in the order they are entered. First, the text you want to display in the center of the text box. This can be any valid string. Second, the text you want to display on the title bar at the top of the text box. This can be any valid string. Third, the buttons you wish to see on your message box. The default is 0, and it will display just the OK button. The list of button choices is shown below. Fourth, the icon you want to display on the side of the text box. The default is 0, and it is the same as none. The list of icon choices is shown below. Fifth, this associates the Enter Return key to a button on the message box. When the Enter Return key is pressed, it is the same as clicking on the associated button. The default value is 0, and it's the same as pressing the first button on the message box. The list of default button choices is shown below. Sixth, the message box options. These can be used in combination. When using them in combination, the choices are joined with an OR, not AND, OR, because these values are being combined using bitwise math. For further information, research bitwise and bitwise OR. Some of these options are incompatible with the Help button, parameter 7, and they are highlighted in orange. The list of Messagebox options is shown below. Seventh, this parameter lets you add or remove a help button. By default, this value is false and there is no help button. The two valid inputs are shown below. If you add a help button by making this parameter true, there are 3 extra steps you will need to perform to make it work. First, you must add and remove the event handler around the Messagebox command. If the help button is pressed, a custom subroutine will run. In this example, the custom subroutine is named Help Subroutine. Second, you must create a custom subroutine in your program. In this example, it is named Help Subroutine. Help Subroutine will do whatever you want. In this example, it is going to beep and then open Form 2. Third, you will need to create a new form to make your help form. This can be done by selecting Add Form under the Project dropdown. If you find these videos useful, please like and subscribe. It is the only way I can continue to make these videos.